welcome to our very first YouTube Live. We are talking about a very important discussion tonight about mental health in the South Asian community. And we're going to start off with a discussion. Let's introduce ourselves first. I'm Dr. Reena Malik. I'm a urologist, and I have started the South Asian Wellness Group to help bring education to the South Asian community. And I have with me Dr. Monisha Vasa and Dr. Saumya Dave. Please introduce yourselves.
I'm Dr. Monisha Vasa. I'm a behavioral and addiction psychiatrist and writer in Orange County.
Hi, I'm Saumya Dave. I'm a psychiatrist, an author, and a mental health advocate, and so excited to be here today.
Great. So also, if you guys stick around till the very end of this live session, both Dr. Vasa and Dr. Dave will be giving away a copy of their books. They are both published authors and have amazing books. Dr. Dave, we're going to be talking about her book very shortly called Well-Behaved Indian Women. And Dr. Monisha Vasa is an author of a book called Salve, Words for the Journey. Awesome. So, Dr. Dave has written this really awesome book. I loved it, called Well-Behaved Indian Women. And I want you to just kind of give everyone an overview of the book and maybe a little insight into what inspired you to write about this.
Sure. So Well-Behaved Indian Women, at its core, it's about 3 generations of strong South Asian women navigating struggles in their personal and professional lives. They all go on their own journeys throughout this book and really find the courage to live on their own terms. And we can even talk about some specifics later in our discussion. But what really inspired me to write the book is that I struggled to find books where I felt represented and where I felt my family and friends were represented, and where I saw strong South Asian women going after what they wanted in a very unapologetic way. So really just looking for something to read where I thought I could relate to the characters on the page is what initially inspired me to do this. And then it took about 10 to 11 years from the time that idea was planted in my head to when I actually saw it in my hands. So it's been quite a journey.
That's amazing. So the book, can you give a little summary of kind of without giving away the ending of the story of the book and, what the characters are, a little bit about the characters and the character development. So as we talk about it, they have a little bit of background.
Sure. So the story starts actually with our main character, Simran. She's in her 20s and she's engaged to her high school sweetheart, Kunal, and everything seems to be going well. They're planning their big fat Indian wedding, which, as many of our listeners might know, involve a lot of different things, a lot of events, a lot of opinions, a lot of people chiming in with what they want. And things seem to be going really well until Simran meets Neil Desai, who's this journalist she has admired for many years. And what she thought was actually just a fangirl moment of meeting this guy whose writing she's loved actually turns into a turning point. And she ends up questioning everything that's defined her up until this point in her life. Meanwhile, Simran's mother, Nandini, is this hardworking family medicine physician who has really sacrificed her dreams in order to take care of her family. And she thinks also things are going fine. She's accepted her life for what it is until an old colleague actually comes back in the picture and gives her a professional opportunity of her dreams, but one that would require her to turn her back on everything that she's used to define herself until now. And then the grandmother, Mimi, or Nani, as Simran calls her, she lives in India. She is a very strong widow, and she's actually also keeping a secret of her own. She knows that many years ago, something happened that made her and her daughter, Nandini, drift apart. And now, as she's seeing things unfold between her daughter and granddaughter, she hopes to be the bridge that can put them back together.
I'm like getting chills hearing about the book again, even though I read it a while ago, because it was just so good. I think that what really struck me about your book was these like very defined gender roles that you kind of build up and then over time kind of break them as you mentioned. So I'm going to talk about a few things that I saw in the book. So here you talk about, Nandini's talking about her job at work, and she says, she never has time to eat breakfast or lunch. She's struggling to write notes at the end of the day. She's, and she's constantly having to take care of her family members that just show up unannounced and be like, oh, can you check this out for me? And so she gets behind in clinic and she's obligated to do this. And this really resonated with me. And as women, I think we very often feel obligated to do things for other people. And that's our role. I kind of want to get your sense of what how that feels for you and how you develop that in her character.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with everything you just said. I think there's this idea that our job is to take care of other people and also put our needs last. And I know that, the idea of boundaries is being spoken about more. Even on Instagram, I think I see more about that. But I think a lot of times the woman who is upheld is the one who doesn't have those boundaries. She gives and she gives and she gives. And with Nandini, I wanted to show how that might present in her family, but also in her profession. She gives at the expense of ever giving to herself. And I think she feels as though that's the way it has to be. This is what she's been taught and this is what's expected of her, but it catches up to her. And I've seen it catch up to a lot of people, and it might not always look the same way. It might even just come out in a conversation with someone trusted. But I've heard so many times in my own life, just women say, I'm exhausted. Where is there space for me at the end of the day? And is it selfish to put my needs first? And there's a lot of guilt that then comes around that. So I wanted guilt to kind of be this side character that comes in and out of the book with all of the women.
Yeah, I think this is so interesting and relevant to all of us. I hear it all the time from my colleagues that women feel guilty, like taking time to be away from their kids, to do anything, whether it's go to the gym or exercise or go spend time with their family. And I think it's something that we all kind of struggle with.
Absolutely. And I think one of the beautiful things about the South Asian community is the exact idea of community. It keeps us connected. I think keeps us anchored. But I also think at the same time, there can be this idea that I owe so much to my community. And if I don't do these certain things, I'm not only letting them down, but I'm also letting the people who love me down. And that can be so tough to have all of that on your shoulders, whether you're a woman or a man. I think that that's a lot to carry. And these characters really do struggle with that in their own times.
Yeah, and I think as oh sorry, I think as someone who grew up watching our mothers do that. I mean, I know for me, my mom worked full time, came home, cooked dinner every day, like never did anything for herself. It was always for us, for the family. And then there's that added, like, I wish I was more like my mother. And like in my house, I don't cook. My husband does all the cooking.
Same.
So, I think that's challenging,
Absolutely.
I was going to say, I feel like that aspect of the community piece, especially within South Asians, you really speak to this so well in the book, can be such a double-edged sword in some ways, because there is that sense of community and there's all that support. And at the same time, there's sort of the expectations that come along with that community. And then the struggle that I think, especially the characters in your book feel when they have to sort of disappoint or let down the expectations of that community, who on one hand can be supportive and encouraging and loving, and on the other hand can be oppressive in some ways. And that's such a difficult balance.
It really is. And I don't know that there's ever a clear answer. I feel as though it's something that shifts with each situation and with the time in your life. And so it's never super clear.
Yeah.
So shifting gears a little bit, at some point there's this little monologue where Nandini is talking about how men can take her power. And she said, I learned all the ways a man could try and take my power. There was a senior resident who grabbed her butt every morning. And then when she tried to report him, she was told that's the way things have always been. She was, when she went to her first medical practice, she was told she had to socialize with people at strip clubs, and there were men who freely commented on her appearance. And I think that this is, really important to highlight. And I'd love to get your thoughts on it, because I think that, do women feel like they have to accept that as a way of being, or particularly in the South Asian community, are we not allowed to speak up against those things?
Sure. I've heard, I don't know, and I would love to hear from both of you if this has been a similar experience. I've heard the phrase, this is how it always is. And this is how it's been so many times, to kind of justify and explain why certain things that may have not sat so well with me are the way they are. And I think in medicine, that also happens, because medicine, the way the training happens and the way the feedback happens and the way you almost have to prove yourself, it's set in a very, very old tradition of going about things in a way and not really questioning so much, whether that's a gendered thing or not. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think that Nandini really felt like in order for me to rise and for me to get to the next step, I have to put up with certain things that might feel very uncomfortable and at times very, very wrong. But this is what I have to do to get ahead. And I think that can be such a hard place where when you feel like you have to have certain things happen to you in order to make it to where you really want to go, you kind of convince yourself, okay, this is the battle and I need to win the war. But at what point does that balance really tip into a negative place? When does that happen? And I think it's different for every person, but definitely I think it's a struggle that I've had. She has it throughout the whole book. And so many of the women I know have had that in their careers and in their personal lives.
And I actually love in Nandini's character, there's a scene later on where she's at work and there's a resident who's having sort of an anxious moment in front of her, and she kind of reassures the resident. I think she says something like, there's plenty of time to answer this question, kind of takes the pressure off. And it's this moment where you can see she's trying to, in her own way, sort of shift the culture of training and practice within medical education, and kind of change that narrative a little bit. And, it struck me in that moment in the book that this is how the culture will shift, that sort of toxic culture of this is how things have always been done, is when, any of us sort of choose those moments to do things a little bit differently.
So true.
So another part where I think this is so, like, if anyone has grown up with, parents who we're first generation, our parents came from India, that if Simran gets caught hanging out with an opposite gender person outside and her mom is like, you're ruining everything. Like, how could you do this to us? And I can tell you, like, this is just so relatable for me personally. And I'm sure many of the people who grew up in our generation, about how, like, just hanging out with someone who's a man is considered so atrocious or like egregious in our culture. And I love that you put that out there, and put that in the book, because it's just so true.
Well, I think the idea of what will people think and what will they say just comes up often, all the time. And that drives so much, at least for me in my own personal life growing up, that drove a lot of my fear of, oh my gosh, is this going to reflect poorly? And I don't even think I really realized that until I was much older. But definitely, I think the way you're seen and what you're doing and who you're hanging out with and what rules are you breaking and who's seeing you break those rules? Is it some auntie seeing it and they're going to report back to the rest? And definitely that can put so much of that pressure and weight and fear on you.
Yeah, I think that it was a big part of the book is, and this is big in South Asian communities, is like, what will people think? But I think it takes away from the being present and being here and being now, which I think so many people struggle with. How, obviously you brought that into the book throughout, but how do you think that we can kind of work towards being more present and not worrying about what other people think? Because I think it takes so much mental chatter.
It does. I feel, and this is, one of the many reasons I think this event is such a great idea. I think conversations create change. I think the more people kind of face these ideas and they kind of go against these ideas and they say, you know what, this is not really sitting well with any of us and nobody really likes this. I think that is a huge first step that takes time, but I am happy to see on and off social media, people really saying exactly what you did, that how do we change this? We don't want this anymore. And I think that is really the key, is to know that a lot of us feel that way. And we want to work towards making sure that when we're kind of in that position of power and change, that we change that narrative.
And also, I think it's one of those things where we may not always feel courageous or confident to sort of step out of those boundaries of, the approval and what other people think within the community. And it's sometimes, I think, if we wait for the courage or if we wait for the readiness to shatter some of those expectations or that desire for approval, we might be waiting a very, very long time. And in fact, sometimes we just have to take the step, whether we feel ready or not. Sometimes we're forced to take the step just because our life circumstances, kind of, we're just in a place where we have to, but sometimes I think we have to take the step to break out of that need for approval, and then sort of the emotional readiness actually catches up after the fact.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, that's great. So at the end of the book, they take these dramatic, changes in their lives, which you kind of described. And they call ambition she's like, men wear ambition as a cape, and women are cursed by ambition. And they talk about how they have to be scandalized basically to pursue this, a different path. Essentially, it's not wrong, it's just different from the typical South Asian pathway. And so, I'd love for you to comment more on that in the South Asian community, because I think it's so important that taking a path less traveled should be less stigmatized. I think that we would be so much further, not just all doctors and engineers, if we had done, outside the box sort of things.
Absolutely. I actually, when I was an intern, I wrote an article called The Paradox of Being an Educated Indian Girl. Got a lot of responses from it on all ends of the spectrum, as I'm sure you can imagine. But I wrote it because, and it was about the idea that I feel as though when we're younger, girls and boys are told to do well in school and to have big dreams and to work really hard. But then as we get maybe into our early 20s, I don't know what age exactly it is, I think it varies. I think it's commonplace then girls should be finding someone and they should be thinking about when they should have children. And if that requires their ambition to be dimmed a little bit, then that's okay. But I don't really often ever hear boys being told to shift their ambition to fit the needs of a family. And I do think that's something that should change. I agree with you. I think that if we become more comfortable with all members of a family wanting to live largely and live out of the box, that's when we'll make really big strides as a community. And again, this is something I'm seeing change as well with each subsequent generation. But I do feel that, our parents came here and a lot of times security was such a big thing. And I understand that they had different hurdles than what I had. So the things that motivated them and the things that they needed were so different. And so a big part of me really does understand why a lot of these lessons are passed down to us to have practical jobs and to go after certain careers, because I think they're there to ensure our safety and security at the end of the day. I think the intentions so often come from a really pure and a place of love, but it's what happens along the way when we want to take a different path. That's when things maybe get a little bit more complicated. So I do hope that with each year we see more and more people, women and men, just taking those risks, living out of the box, maybe feeling like there's a sense of security to be had from something else, from the path less traveled by, and to feel that there's support if you do decide to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right to speak to sort of the intention and kind of where some of the that desire for women and men to pursue these sort of secure career pathways, or for women to pursue secure relationships, that the intention comes from that immigrant experience, and the desire for there to be a sense of safety and financial security and job security and all of those things. And yet, of course, as you're speaking to, as each generation, evolves, the experience is going to also evolve. And maybe our needs, safety may not be the priority when it comes to what we're defining as our needs. It might be, creative expression, or it might be sort of that need or desire to live outside of the box. And so the needs and wants and priorities of each subsequent generation will evolve as, organically, as they should.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're completely right about them wanting us to have security, financial stability. A lot of our parents immigrated from, South Asia, India, Pakistan, wherever, and came with very little income and had to build something so big and provide us safety and food and shelter and all those things. And they never wanted us to worry about those things. No. So I think that that's true. But I think also they're worried about that risk that we are going to take if we do something that's off the beaten path. So lastly, you did during the book talk a little bit about anxiety. You described some anxiety attacks and some postpartum depression in Nandini when she's kind of describing her life over time. I think that was so great that you put that in there, because so many South Asians suffer from anxiety, depression, things like that. And I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on how often you're seeing this and what your thoughts were on including that in her story.
Oh, definitely. I agree with you that so many are struggling with depression, anxiety, and many other things that feel very scary and uncertain. And in her case, I wanted to show that she had a lot of struggles that she felt she had to keep to herself. And that did come, with her postpartum depression, with her panic attacks. And her mom really understood, because her mom also had depression, which is alluded to a few times in the book. It's not fully explored. But her mom knows the value of getting care for that mental health as though it were her physical health, and seeing those on the same plane. And I think she really, really did need that. And another comment that's kind of come up about mental health with the book is that Kunal actually suggests couples therapy at one point in the book. And I do think that it was important for me to know that I think so many of us want to change the narrative around what we do about our mental health, whether that's talking about it, getting treatment, getting support, whatever it is, and that can come in so many different forms. And it's something that we just do need to normalize, I think, as a world, not even just our community, but really as a world, because I think that the shame around it keeps people quiet. It definitely kept Nandini quiet for a very, very long time. But really, it's the conversations, going back to conversations about mental health. I think that's one of the main things we can do to help.
Yeah, absolutely. And you really see the way that experience of kind of struggling with anxiety and postpartum symptoms and not necessarily having the support and the treatment that she might have had or could have had, how that experience really stayed with her, and I think that that's something that we're really hoping to shift as we continue to try to have this conversation about mental health in the South Asian community, is that it doesn't have to be that way, that there is support available, there is treatment available, and just continuing to try to normalize seeking that type of support the same way, as you said, that we would for physical conditions.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we transition to talking about mental health in the South Asian community, I wanted to get your both thoughts on what can someone of the South Asian descent do if they're trying to look for doing something that's unconventional or off the beaten path and they're not getting the support they need. What advice do you have for them?
Well, I think, so I was just reading about this the other day in a different context, but when you have big goals, I think breaking them down into smaller goals and kind of seeing how that feels can be a helpful way to start, if it's relevant to whatever someone's trying to do. So if the dream is, my second book has a stand-up comedian actually in it. And so if the dream is to someday go on stage and be a stand-up comedian, is it possible to do an open mic night sometime? Is it possible to write something small and then see how that feels and how that is? And does that pursuit of the passion give you that strength that maybe you've relied on from others before? So is there a way to kind of shift that autonomy and to make it more inwards? And so that would probably be my starting point advice, depending on what the project was.
I love that. Yeah, I would say, I mean, it's a tough thing, Saumya and I actually had briefly talked about this, about what it was like even to pursue writing as South Asians, and probably for both of us, it was a little bit more acceptable because we also pursued the traditional medical path as well, so that probably helped matters a little bit. But, I would say there's a couple of aspects. I mean, one, I think just really staying close to your intention, like what is it with this sort of more creative or unconventional path that you want to take? What is your intention behind that, for yourself and for the larger communities around you? And I think staying connected to that intention really helps to, when things get difficult or when you may not get approval or support, that intention might carry you through. And I think the second thing that I would suggest is, really kind of finding a chosen family, like especially if your family hasn't necessarily caught up to, being ready to quite support you or be there for you in the ways that you need, to find a community of friends or supporters or advocates who really can kind of stay by your side and to support and encourage you on your journey. I think, both of those things, I've been blessed, my family has been supportive, but, I do think that having friends who have been just equally encouraging has made such a big difference in terms of even my own confidence and willingness to take risks or put myself out there.
Love that.
So Such great advice, guys. I love it too. I think finding your, like, I find that all this tribe that we've made through South Asian Wellness, through Instagram, through social media has been super helpful, and feeling like you're not alone in doing these things that are kind of unconventional and not necessarily just direct patient care, especially when you go into medicine. So that's awesome. And I love the idea of taking it like kind of one step at a time, and taking on the challenge slowly and building up your confidence, because it's a big deal when you're taking on something that's so different, and sometimes just ripping off the band-aid to get started just gets the wheels turning. Mm-hmm. So if there are any questions on the YouTube Live, please post them in the comments. For those of you who are watching right now, if you are wanting to win one of the 2 books by the authors, please make sure to put a comment in the comment section, because the winner will be chosen from the comments. And also, we will be showing it at the end of the session. So moving on to discussing specifically mental health in the South Asian community, can you both let us know what exactly is the most common thing that you see in the South Asian population in the patients you take care of?
Yes, so I work in a couple of different environments. I do have a private practice here in Orange County, and then I also do a lot of work with physician wellness, especially resident physician wellness, with a couple of institutions here in Southern California. And so I also see a lot of South Asians through that venue as well. And I would say for myself, the most common thing that I see is still depression and anxiety. I do see a fair amount of substance abuse as well. That might be because I'm an addiction psychiatrist. So I do tend to see more individuals who happen to struggle with substance use disorders. But I would say, especially in the South Asian community, these are substance use disorders that haven't yet been diagnosed or even identified as problematic. So these tend to be the most common diagnoses that I see. Outside of formal diagnosis, I think still sort of the struggle with kind of high pressure, high achievement focus, which does tend to increase stress, contribute to burnout. So, those of course are not official diagnoses, but sort of common mental health themes that I'm seeing in the South Asian community.
I agree with everything you just said. I would say depression and anxiety, and then also a lot of guilt. And a lot of perfectionism, I would say, kind of that are woven with the depression and the anxiety, but those are the top 2 I see by far.
And what is the most surprising to you? I mean, all of this stuff kind of doesn't sound really surprising to me necessarily, but is there something that really you would say is different than what you would expect when you take care of South Asian patients?
Let me think. I mean, I do think maybe it's not as surprising. It makes me just more sad, in a broader sense, is that there's still so much trouble. I often see it in talking about it with families. And I see a difference also between going to therapy versus taking medication. So I will see a lot of times patients will come in and they'll want the therapy, but that barrier, if they do require medication or if they're interested in medication, that's actually an entirely different barrier. And that's something I wasn't expecting. I think because of training, I had it all in one bucket, that if you want to get treatment for your mental health, you're prepared for whatever might be prescribed to you. But I've seen a much bigger barrier around taking an antidepressant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that what continues to surprise me, I mean, I think there still is, and this relates exactly to what you're saying, Saumya, just that there still is so much shame and stigma that continues to surround mental illness, within the South Asian community. I don't know if part of that is because I know at least in India, mental illness for many years was seen as such a taboo concept, and patients who struggled with mental illness were not really necessarily fully integrated, accepted, had adequate access to treatment. And so, maybe some of those ideas still kind of carrying over and then filtering down. But Yeah, still that there is a barrier that we're not looking at seeing a psychiatrist the same way that we would look at seeing a primary care physician or an OBGYN, or, having depression as the same thing as having high blood pressure or a thyroid problem. That, it still is really seen as something that is either sort of a weakness of the mind or can be overcome in some other way, or maybe doesn't necessarily need allopathic types of treatment, but maybe more sort of like alternative, interventions. And so I think, yeah, that even though I can understand sort of the roots and where it comes from, and of course we're broadly struggling with shame and stigma around mental illness, not just in the South Asian community, but just in general. But I think it still does continue to surprise me that we're still, having this conversation and trying to sort of advocate for, equal treatment the way we would with any other medical problem.
Yeah, that's really tragic, and it makes sense to me that South Asian people would be resistant to taking medications for mental illness. I've seen it personally as well, and I think that it's a shame because they could really gain help from those interventions, and it will kind of deter from those. Also, one of our viewers made a comment that the abuse is such a silent topic in our community, drug abuse, alcohol abuse. Can you comment a little bit on that, Monisha?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I really feel from a psychiatrist standpoint, we have to do a very careful history, and we need to really ask very clear, non-judgmental questions to really elicit somebody's patterns of substance abuse. Sometimes it can take a long time for some of those patterns to be revealed. There really has to be a trusting relationship, especially when the psychiatrist is South Asian, because the patient, really wonders whether we might carry some of the same judgments that they're seeing in their communities at large. And so, yeah, a very careful history, a lot of time spent building a trusting relationship with the patient in order for them to feel safe and comfortable, opening up to some of those patterns. And then also really, again, this is sort of just careful history taking with sort of identifying any co-occurring mental health conditions that might be contributing to that type of self-medication with substances. By far the most common substance I see in the South Asian community is still alcohol, but also increasingly cannabis, and also stimulants, again, with this sort of issue of sort of high academic pressure and achievement focus. The use of stimulants to study, to perform on tests and so forth, can also be problematic, So really, the main challenge, I would say, is still diagnosis and identification, just because, again, with this shame piece, it's really hard for our communities to open up. And the other thing that I see, with the addiction piece, sometimes I'll be seeing, a young adult within a family, but also seeing that there is addiction in the parental generation that also hasn't been identified, diagnosed, or treated. And again, a lot of shame cemented around, substance abuse patterns within the parental generation as well. So there's a lot of layers there to really unpack. And I think our job, not just as psychiatrists, but physicians and medical professionals in general, is to really approach, these issues again with a lot of non-judgment, so that, there's eventually a sense of trust and willingness to open up.
And another comment here is they're seeing a lot of anger and self-destructive behavior in South Asians who are, at high performing or high level South Asian people. Do you guys find you're seeing that a lot as a corollary to maybe coping with mental illness or coping with other kind of stressors in life?
Yeah, I've always thought of, and Monisha, I would love to know, your thoughts on this. I've always seen anger as, I called it an iceberg emotion, because I think often it presents and it's what we see, and it's very loud, and it often, it gets our attention. But really, there's so much that tends to be behind and beneath anger. I think sometimes there's shame, sometimes there's guilt, sometimes there's that feeling of not being appreciated or heard. And so really, if somebody is angry, and that's become kind of a more constant in their lives, I really want to know what else is going on, because I find that there usually are so many layers to that and there are roots to it. And so that's really the value of a mental health professional, is to really get underneath that anger and seeing what's going on there, because I really see it as something that represents a lot of other things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. I think the iceberg metaphor is such a good one, or kind of seeing it as like a secondary emotion, that there's often something underneath. And I think the question also speaks to maybe sort of this issue of like rebellion in some ways, that often I think many of us have grown up in really controlled environments with very specific focus on like being goal oriented and, the approval of our communities and all of these. And that sometimes once we get to college or we get to this place of independence, that there's almost like a release phenomenon of going to the other extreme. And that can sometimes manifest in sort of rebellious behavior, self-destructive behavior, depending on the extent of it. And so I think, yeah, again, if those individuals ever, reach that point where they're sort of seeking mental health support, I think it really requires the unpacking of, as you said, Saumya, where is this really coming from? And are there healthier outlets or ways to cope that we can eventually move towards, so that we're not, being self-destructive or self-injurious, but actually dealing with the underlying emotions and then channeling them in maybe a more adaptive way.
And what about, physical, emotional, sexual abuse in the South Asian population? Um, is that something that you're seeing a lot of people hiding or covering up, and how are you dealing with that?
Yes, unfortunately, I would say the answer is yes. I mean, I have had several South Asian patients in my private practice where, again, it kind of is something that gets revealed with time and sort of in the context of a trusting relationship. Interestingly, one sort of common thread that I've seen to some extent, and this comes especially with I would say more types of like sexual abuse or maybe molestation, is kind of like a minimization of it in some ways, like, oh, everybody in our community deals with this at some point with, some relative or some, family friend, and almost sort of like a normalization of like, oh, we've all dealt with that and we've all been there. And, I think our job as mental health professionals is to really reinforce or remind, in a careful way, that none of these behaviors are ever okay or acceptable, no matter how common or prevalent they are, and to really look at what is the actual emotional impact of those experiences, and how is that in any way contributing to or fueling any mental health symptoms, whether that's, trauma, PTSD, depression, difficulty in intimacy with, our adult relationships, and to really sort of draw out those connections, and investigate and understand those relationships. But I really do think it very much does exist. And again, we need to be asking the questions, and not normalizing those behaviors.
I completely agree. I actually sometimes have that thought in the back of my head. What has happened that I don't know about, that I haven't been told about? Because I agree, if I have ever have been told about those experiences, it's been after a long time. And I completely get that. It just makes me wonder, how much are people really carrying around and holding?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that takes us to a really important question here, is how do we get our family and friends or ourselves to take that step to see a mental health professional? I think because of the stigma, because of all the things that we've grown up with. I mean, even I went to see a counselor in college and my mom was like, "What are you doing?" I posted about it on my Instagram recently, but I think, these are issues that are challenging for us to overcome. So how can we help ourselves or help our friends or family to actually take that step and not be afraid?
Yeah, it's a big hurdle that we're all trying to overcome, in some ways. I mean, I think that social media has been a really powerful tool. We're seeing a lot of, wonderful accounts kind of really encouraging and supporting, South Asian individuals to seek support and seek help. I know the South Asian Wellness Docs recently did a whole series that was wonderful on postpartum depression, and, you know, so many, female physicians, South Asian physicians coming forward and sharing their stories. I really think that it's about just continuing to, I think I've said this a few times now, just normalizing the conversation. I mean, I think that sometimes that starts with us. I'm very open that I see a therapist regularly and that it's a critical part of my own health maintenance, the same way that I would see a primary care physician. And, really, I think when we share our own experience openly, whether that's our own experience of a struggle or of seeking treatment, in a way, we're really saying, I'm okay with putting this out there. And it gives other people permission to also do the same thing. So I think it really starts with ourselves. I think the more that we can continue to share our stories, the more that we can continue to, encourage and support those around us, our kids, that's how we're going to gradually shift things in a more positive direction.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think now there is a great database, southasiantherapists.org, that does have a list of South Asian practicing therapists. And I would really want to know, just, I think active listening and compassionate listening can always go a long way, no matter what the situation is. But if someone is having those barriers towards going, I'd want to know just what they are and hear them out, and then maybe talk through those, because everybody can be at different places in what they're ready for and in what they're not ready for. And so I'd come from a place of curiosity and compassion, just to see where that person is at and why. But I mentioned the database because I know I've heard a few of my own friends say, I don't want to speak to someone who doesn't understand the cultural things I'm up against. And I think there's so much validity to that, because that adds an entirely different lens through how we're experiencing the world and ourselves. And so sometimes being able to provide, like the resources Monisha talked about, can just show that we're not alone, and there are avenues that might be more personalized to your specific struggle and what might be helpful for you.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
No, the only other thing I would add is that, if you have a friend or a family member who is struggling but resistant, or hesitant to go in terms of seeking treatment, one way to frame it can always be, just go for a consultation, like you're just going to gather information. You're not committing to taking medication. You're not committing to therapy. You're just really going to gather information about what the process could be like or how it might support you. And sometimes people know, sort of, again, it's kind of like you said, Saumya, like break it down into small steps. Like if you can just take the first step,
Mm-hmm.
you're still planting a seed that then might come to fruition down the road. So sometimes that can be another helpful way.
Totally.
So what signs or symptoms should people look for if they're not really sure, like they think something might be wrong, but they're not 100% sure? What can they do?
You mean in their loved ones, or in themselves, or anyone, like in general?
Both, but yeah, mostly like their loved ones, their friends, their family, and
Sure.
themselves.
This came up on an Instagram post that I saw the other day. I think it was Psyched Mommy, which is one of the accounts I really love for maternal mental health. But she put up the question that if someone asks, I don't feel like myself, what do I do? I think that's a big sign that something's been off for a while. And of course, we can definitely go over some of those more standard signs of depression and anxiety from a diagnostic perspective. But I think anger, since that also came up before, having that persistent anger, that persistent feeling that you're just not yourself, and that there are things about life that would have been enjoyable before, but they no longer are. And there's this lack of motivation and this lack of just wanting to be a part of of it all, those can be signs, whether it's in yourself or in others, that it's time to maybe talk to someone and to get someone else on board with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I would say any noticeable change in behavior, like if you're talking about a friend or a family member and all of a sudden you're noticing that there's a significant change in their appetite, their sleep, their behaviors or their patterns, that would always be a red flag. If you're noticing an increase, as we talked about earlier, in maybe alcohol use or self-medication with substances, that is always a red flag. Certainly statements that allude to maybe passive thoughts of not wanting to live anymore, or thoughts of self-harm, or as you mentioned earlier, self-destructive or self-injurious behaviors. These are always concerning symptoms to look out for. I would also say isolation, if somebody all of a sudden has kind of fallen off the planet and you're used to being in touch with them, that would also, to me, be a red flag to maybe reach out and just check in and, make sure everything's okay.
And so, this can be very challenging to find the right words. I know you've mentioned coming from a place of curiosity and opening the dialogue, but what are some, what can they say? What can be the words that you can use to approach somebody if you're not really sure? Like, hey, you've been a little bit aloof lately, or but without making them be on the defensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would always just recommend starting with I statements and saying, I'm worried about you, or, I just noticed that we haven't, been talking as much anymore, or the other day I noticed, X, Y, and Z, and it made me feel concerned or worried. Is everything okay? With friends and family, I'll often do just I'm just checking in, I may not even speak to if something worried or concerned me, but I'll say, hey, I'm just checking in to see how you're doing, just again, kind of opening up the lines of communication. If somebody, has expressed that they are struggling or that they need professional support or professional help, at that point, I just encourage that. And I would say something like, I'm happy to help you get connected to somebody, or, if you'd like me to go with you to the first appointment, even if you're not going in the room, but you're just waiting in the waiting room or waiting in the car, just the offer can feel supportive to somebody. So those are usually some of the ways that I might reach out.
Mm-hmm. I think this came up once in one of the motherhood talks we put together about postpartum depression, but just asking about how day-to-day life and functioning are going, and then being prepared to just listen. Because I think sometimes unsolicited advice can be really hard, particularly in the motherhood time. I think it comes quite often, but of course, anytime that unsolicited advice isn't always received well, whereas unsolicited support often is. So I think in what are we giving, and how are we giving it, and what are we showing we're there for the person to provide, can be just really big.
Mm-hmm.
Those are great points. So before we go to the meditation, I have one last question for you guys. What is something that you specifically want South Asian people to know? What is one thing, if this is all they listen to today, what's the one thing you want them to take home?
Oh gosh.
Go ahead. Sure. I would say you are not alone. You are not alone. Whether you're dealing with a victory or a struggle, you are not alone. You don't have to go through it alone. And this is something my friend Bansuri actually told me this just a couple of weeks ago. It doesn't have to feel bad. It doesn't have to be this way. If you are struggling, the goal doesn't have to be to just make it through the day and to just survive. It doesn't have to be that way. And so there is help out there. We are here for you. There are resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. And I would say that the main thing that I would want people to know is that treatment is available, that these are conditions where, for the most part, treatment does work, whether that's some combination of medications, psychotherapy, psychoeducation, and that, you don't have to suffer, that if we can get you connected to the right type of, psychiatrist and therapist, that treatment and support is available, and that you can you can be better, you can feel better. And so I think often with mental health, especially with depression, we feel like it's always been this way, it's always going to be this way. And that's really not the case. We have treatment works, and I would really want people to know that they can get better.
Great advice. I will add my 2 cents here. And my 2 cents are that asking for help doesn't mean that you're weak. I ask for help every day, every single day. I ask for help on something. I call somebody and ask for help with work. I ask for help with my parents, to help with my kids. I ask my husband to help me with things. And I ask for help when I'm drowning, when I feel like I can't take on anymore, I've taken on too much. And that's okay. And I think that really, like, if you don't see a therapist, that's okay, but ask somebody for help, because it's important to talk. It's important to have the discussion, and we're here for you. Absolutely. All right, so lastly, thank you guys who are here live. If you want to be entered in the giveaway for the 2 books that we are giving away tonight, Well-Behaved Indian Women and Salve Words for the Journey by Dr. Vasa and Dr. Dave, please make a comment in the chat so that we can pick a winner after the end of the meditation. And so we are going to move on. I'm going to give you guys a couple minutes to put some comments in before we start the meditation, because there is a little bit of a lag on from us to YouTube.
Oh my gosh. I feel like everyone can hear my baby screaming. I'm so sorry.
My kids are screaming also outside the door.
So are mine outside my door.
Close the doors, everyone, okay?
It's okay to do that, though.
It's okay to close the door.
In a way, it's good, because we don't know whose kids are who. So it all just our collective children that are screaming. Yeah.
One voice.
Okay, I think we can get started now. So Dr. Vasa, I'll give it to you.
Thank you. So we thought maybe a meditation, a mindfulness-based meditation, might just be a nice way to kind of wrap up our session today. So why don't we all just go ahead and gently close the eyes. We won't be meditating for too long, but perhaps just settle into a posture that feels comfortable, where you feel relaxed yet alert. And maybe just beginning by taking a couple of breaths a little bit more deeply than normal. Perhaps noticing the sensations caused in the body by the movement of the breath. And maybe just beginning by setting an intention for these next few moments of meditation, that we're not really trying to get anywhere, not trying to accomplish anything. We're not even trying to relax or even trying to meditate, really. We're simply just taking a moment to be present with ourselves and to notice whatever is arising in this moment, and just meeting that with curiosity and non-judgment, as we've been talking about. And maybe just connecting for a moment with the body, perhaps even for the first time today. Just noticing what's arising in the body. Perhaps you notice sensations or a sense of motion or momentum. Just noticing. And perhaps also noticing within the sensations that are arising, whether there are any spaces of stillness or ease within the body that already exist. Even if it's in maybe a finger or a toe, part of the body that's already at ease without having to do anything. And just noticing what this spaciousness feels like in this part of the body. And then bringing the awareness to the mind, checking in with the mind the same way that we just checked in with the body. And simply noticing, again, perhaps there's a lot of energy, a lot of thought, a lot of movement. Perhaps there's slowness or fatigue. Just checking in. Where is the mind at? And in the same way, noticing within the vast spaciousness of the mind, are there any moments of stillness that already exist? Perhaps a moment between thoughts, or a moment of calm. Just noticing. And then directing the same awareness to our emotions. Checking in with our emotions and our feelings. Perhaps noticing anything that maybe came up during our conversation. Difficult emotions, positive emotions. Again, with curiosity and non-judgment, even perhaps a sense of friendliness towards whatever's arising. And again, just noticing whether perhaps in this mix of emotion, is there any space of ease, of stillness? And can we find that? Perhaps the same way that we might notice the stretch of sky that surrounds a bird in motion. Can we notice the space? And then bringing the attention back to the breath, just for one or two more breaths. Again, noticing the sensation of the breath moving through the body. And as we wrap up our time together, perhaps just taking a moment of gratitude. For the conversation, perhaps any thoughts or ideas that arose, for even just taking the time for yourself. And perhaps noticing if there were any moments of clarity, of insight, of stillness that arose during the conversation or during this meditation, perhaps just energetically sending that out to anybody who perhaps couldn't be present. May all beings everywhere, without exception, ourselves included, may all beings everywhere be happy and free from suffering.
That was so great. Thank you so much. I feel so much calmer in my headspace. I will, we have 2 winners for our giveaway. I'm going to comment with your information in the chat and also the email to contact us to receive your prize. Just before we end, I want to let everyone know of our next event that we are doing. It is focused on breast cancer, not just a concern for aunties, a discussion on premenopausal breast cancer genetics, risk, and previvorship. And we have a huge panel. We have Dr. Anjali Malik, a breast radiologist, Dr. Ambakar, who is a breast surgeon. We have Dr. Simran Malhotra, who is a previvor with BRCA1. We have Dr. Rima Jawaria, who is a gastroenterologist and recently diagnosed with breast cancer, undergoing active treatment. And we have Roshni Kamta, who was diagnosed with triple negative breast cancer and has documented her journey on Instagram and her treatment. And so I think it's going to be an outstanding event. It's going to be October 8th at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will be sending out information about where to find it and how to connect. So make sure you follow us on Instagram at South Asian Docs, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and sign up for our email list so that you don't miss out any of our amazing events. They will all be posted also on our website, southasianwellness.org. Thank you guys so much for participating today. We loved having you.
Thank you so much for having us.